When I first started sourdough, most of my loaves turned out sad and flat. But now I get sourdough with great rise and flavor. Today I'm going to show you the 18 mistakes that keep you from making the amazing sourdough that you want. Sourdough is one of the best parts of being a baker. It is a feat you accomplish. It brings people together and it tastes like sunshine and happiness. With that joy, however, there comes many pitfalls. Sticky dough, flat bread, or a starter that just refuses to rise. It's really a part of the sourdough experience. If you haven't opened your oven to see a loaf like this, then you are one of the few, because most, if not all of us, have had that devastating loaf reveal that left us heartbroken. I do believe, however, that there are several steps you can take to avoid this situation. So today, as I make a sourdough loaf from scratch, I'm going to break down everything that you should avoid in order to create a loaf with great oven spring and flavor. This video will hopefully give you the confidence and knowledge to make your own incredible sourdough loaf. So get your starter and flour out and bake a sourdough loaf along with me as I go through all the 18 mistakes. The first mistake to avoid is baking with a non-active starter. I think that this mistake is often overlooked because in our minds, it doesn't necessarily equate to the actual dough. This is, however, incorrect because the starter is truly the leaven that determines if your dough will spring or not spring. The starter gives your bread its flavor. It is the yeast that the bread needs in order to truly be a great loaf of sourdough. If you are using the starter after it has already fallen, if your starter isn't doubling in size in the first place, or it is not passing the float test, you are actually baking with a non-active starter. It all begins with a healthy starter, so let's feed Genevieve. To feed your starter, determine if you are going to feed once or twice a day. In an idealistic world, the answer would be twice a day. But that is just simply not very realistic for the everyday baker. I certainly do not do it. Your starter will not suffer if you feed it once a day, like I do. However, if I have several loaves I need to make, I will do twice a day. A starter is really just a combination of flour and water. They come together to make a culture for the wild bacteria and the wild yeast. The bacteria and yeast then eat the sugars in the flour and release CO2, which causes the starter to rise. The starter is what people have used to make bread for a very long time, and I think it is awesome that many people are making their way back to that tradition. For its unique taste and health benefits compared to store-bought bread, sourdough is unbeatable. To start your sourdough process, you will most likely need to discard some of your starter from your jar. You can throw this away if you want to, but I believe it is a much better alternative to use a discard sourdough recipe, or take 2 minutes and whip up some delicious sourdough crackers. All you need to do is pour your discard into a bowl, add some olive oil and salt, and bake it at 350 degrees for 10 minutes. Take them out to score them, put them back in until you reach your desired crunch level. And there you have it. Another sourdough discard recipe that is super easy to make. I am pouring my starter into a new jar, and what is left in my old jar will just be the discard. But I usually will just discard some from the same jar. Now we are going to feed the starter to get it ready to bake with. I am going to do a maintenance feed of 1 to 2, meaning for every 1 part of sourdough starter that I have, I'm going to add 2 parts equal flour and water. I know I have roughly around 50 grams of starter of Genevieve here, so I'm going to feed her 100 grams of room temperature water and 100 grams of unbleached flour, thus making it a 1 to 2 to 2 ratio. Let me know in the comments if that doesn't make sense, and I'll be happy to explain it further. Once you add these ingredients to your starter, mix it thoroughly. You have to ensure that there are no flour clumps left in the jar. Do your best to make your starter completely smooth and incorporated. I then place a rubber band around my starter line for the purpose of recording exactly how much my starter has grown. Now cover your jar with a cheesecloth or a loosely fit lid and let it grow for 3 to 5 hours. Your starter uses this time to activate and become ready to leaven your loaf. When you see that your starter has doubled in size or more than doubled in size or is just beginning to pass its peak, you can use it in your dough. The longer your starter has to eat the food you just gave it, the more sourdough flavor your bread will have. This is because as bacteria becomes more active, it produces more lactic acid and acetic acid. These acids build up and give the bread that classic sourdough tang and taste that we all love. The second mistake is using your starter too early or too late. Since we are here with Genevieve as she is growing, let's talk about the proper timing for using the starter. You want to use your starter when it hits what we call its peak. The peak is when it has used up all of the food and sugars in the flour. It has stopped growing and maybe even has started to drop just a little bit. It will also give off that amazing sour smell that we all love so much. This will happen after your starter has more than doubled in size. You want to use your starter before it begins to really deflate, because that is when your starter is vigorous enough to leaven a loaf of bread. You can also perform the float test, which is where you drop a little dollop of your starter into some water. And if it floats, your starter is ready to be put into your dough. But if it sinks, it is not ready. It's either not vigorous enough or it's deflated. So all in all, use your starter after it hits peak point, but before it begins to deflate and lose its air. The third mistake is not autolysing your bread. Autolysing is letting flour and water develop together before adding starter and salt. You can also add the flour, water, and starter and just hold off on the salt. That is a partial autolyse. Autolysing is incredibly helpful to the gluten structure of your bread. Gluten structure is made up of gliadin and glutenin. These proteins are in your flour. When you mix gliadin and glutenin with water, you get gluten. These two different proteins bond together by the water. There are then little pockets between the bonded gluten structure that can hold the CO2. As fermentation happens, they catch the CO2, which expands the gluten structure and stretches it out. So by delaying adding salt, which tightens the dough, you actually start this fermentation process earlier and allow your dough to expand. Mistake number 4 is not using bread flour. You can use all types of flour for sourdough, such as unbleached, wheat, or rye, but using bread flour in sourdough baking can make a noticeable difference in both the process and the final loaf. Bread flour has a higher protein content than all-purpose flour, which means it can develop more gluten during fermentation. This extra gluten strength gives the dough better structure, allowing it to rise better and hold its shape better. The result is often a loaf with a chewier texture and an open crumb. Bread flour also tends to absorb more water, making it easier to work with higher hydration recipes without the dough becoming too sticky. While all-purpose flour can still make good bread, of course, experimenting with bread flour can help you get a stronger and better loaf and give you more control over your dough's strength and texture. Mistake number 5 is not using baker's percentages. Baker's percentages, or baker's math, is a way of expressing a dough recipe where every ingredient in that recipe is calculated as a percentage of the flour weight. Using baker's percentages makes baking sourdough so much easier. Every percentage that we use, the water, starter, and salt, are calculated as a percentage of the total flour. For example, this loaf has 1,000 grams of flour. If we have 750 grams of water, that would be 75% hydration. We calculate this because 750 grams is 75% of 1,000 grams. If you wanted a higher hydration dough, say maybe 80%, it would be super easy and simple to calculate what is 80% of 1,000. The answer is 800 grams of water. Continuing on, if we have 130 grams of starter, that would be 13% starter. If you get confused, do not worry. Just simply go back to the top where we have 1,000 grams of flour. 130 grams of 1,000 is 13%. So ergo, then we have 13% starter. Lastly, the salt will be 20 grams, which is 2% of 1,000. Having this information will help you as you bake more because it makes the sourdough process so much easier. Baker's percentages makes recipes easier to calculate and change as you see fit. Let's start by adding 700 grams of all-purpose unbleached flour and 300 grams of bread flour. Mistake number 6 is using too high of a hydration too quickly. Like we mentioned before, the hydration level is the percentage of water in your dough to the percentage of flour. Sourdough can turn into glue on your fingers if you overshoot the water before you know how your flour behaves. Sourdough is different than the type of dry doughs that most people are used to working with. It will actually surprise a lot of people by trapping them into a sticky situation. A very wet dough is exciting because it promises a wide open crumb. But for newer hands, it often leads to caked and sticky fingers, rough handling, and a dough that tears apart instead of stretching. Those tears weaken gluten. The dough loses gas and the loaf spreads rather than rises. Temperature and flour type magnify the problem because warm rooms speed fermentation and strong bread flour can soak up more water than all-purpose, so the same formula can feel completely different from one kitchen to another. A simple way to avoid this is to start with a modest hydration and raise the percentage as you continue to bake. For most white bread flours, a starting range of about 60 to 65% hydration gives you a dough that is supple and it can be extensible and much easier to shape. If you are using all-purpose, begin closer to 58 to 62%. And if you add whole wheat, remember that it absorbs more water than all-purpose flour. So increase slowly and observe how the dough changes. Use an autolyse to let the flour fully hydrate before you judge stickiness. By increasing a few percentage points each time that you bake, you build skill and confidence while protecting your dough structure. And you actually reach that open crumb without sacrificing control. I would highly recommend beginning with a lower hydration level and slowly building it to a higher hydration level. I am going to add my water to the flour and I am using a 70% hydration level. Now I'm using my dough whisk to bring together these two ingredients. I'm not doing any lifting and folding right now. I'm simply stirring this together until they become a hydrated mixture. Now that it is fully incorporated, I'm going to let it autolyse for 45 minutes. Anywhere from 20 minutes to 45 minutes works just fine, but of course, usually the longer the better, so that the gluten has more time to develop. Now let's go check out how our starter is doing. Genevieve has been growing for about 4.5 hours. As you can see, she has more than doubled in size, is slightly domed on the top, and is full of gas bubbles. She is exactly what you want your starter to look like before adding her to the loaf. I am going to add 145 grams of starter to my dough. Now I am adding 2% salt, which if you remember, that 2% comes from the total of 1,000 grams of flour. So the 2% of 1,000 grams is 20 grams of salt, which we are going to simply sprinkle on top. Now I'm going to slightly wet my hand with water and begin to lift and fold after dimpling the salt in. All I'm doing here is simply incorporating the different textures that we have going on with the dough. It's not going to be perfect, and that's okay. All that matters is that we continue to lift and fold until a rough dough begins to form. As this dough develops and ferments, it will come together for one wholesome texture. After your first stretch and fold, repeat that process 3 more times, once every half hour. Mistake number 7 is being too gentle or too rough with your dough. You want to stretch your dough without breaking your dough. You are looking for the perfect middle ground here. Your gluten structure is developing in your dough, so the last thing you want to do is rip it apart. Lift your dough until you see the stretch, but before stretching breaks, and then fold it over like so. This will lead us into mistake number 8. Mistake number 8 is to avoid overworking your dough. After the 4th lift and fold, you should feel that your dough is soft, very stretchy at the beginning of the fold, supple and cohesive. Before you start your last lift and fold, you should be able to see that your dough is doming a little bit and is slightly pulling away from the edges of the bowl. That is because the structure is beginning to form. So instead of lying flat in your bowl, it is beginning to rise and develop. When you see these signs, you know that your dough is ready to move into the bulk rise phase. The bulk rise, I estimate, should take around 4 hours, which brings us to mistake number 9. Mistake number 9 is panicking or worrying about the sourdough schedule. You have a lot of flexibility here. My biggest piece of advice here is to work with the fermentation and long process of sourdough instead of against it. If you are finishing your last lift and fold later in the evening and don't have time to let it bulk proof at room temperature, simply put your dough in the fridge. The fridge will slow your fermentation process down. So if you do not have time for the 4 to 6-ish hours of bulk fermentation at room temperature, put your dough in the fridge to let it ferment through the night, and we can start working with it again in the morning. Making sourdough non-intimidating is one of the best ways to start making incredible bread. It's all about making sourdough work for you, not the other way around. That is why I have made a sourdough schedule guide so that you can see what your schedule looks like for baking no matter what time you start. I have 3 different guides to walk you through baking your perfect loaf no matter what your personal schedule is. And they're free, so you can start baking right away. Click the link in the description for free help with your sourdough. Now our dough has fermented for about 4 hours, so let's see if she is ready to shape. Mistake number 10 is shaping too early or too late. If you shape your dough too early, it will not have had enough time to grow and ferment during the bulk fermentation to give you the spring you want in your bread. If you shape it too late, it will have deflated and lost its strength to give you the spring that you want in your bread. So you have to pay close attention to the signs your dough will give you to tell you that it is done with the bulk fermentation. These signs include bubbles on the top and on the sides of your dough, the dough pulling away from the sides of the bowl, and the dough doubling in size. So instead of relying on a specific amount of time for the bulk fermentation, rely on your senses and the signs from the dough. Mistake number 11 is using too much flour in the shaping process. Now that our dough has given us all the signs that it is ready to be shaped, we can go ahead and do the initial shaping. This is also known as pre-shaping or loose shaping. This shaping is simply to get the dough into the correct loose form. It is not the final shaping where we will really refine the dough, which we will do in about half an hour. At this point, many beginner bakers will realize that the dough is sticky to their hands, so they begin to dump loads of flour on the dough to prevent it from sticking. However, you actually need that stickiness for the dough to form a loaf. Of course, you do not want it to be too sticky or else it will just stick to everything and not come together. This is a hard balance to strike and one of the tougher parts about baking sourdough, but with practice, you really can master it and determine what is the perfect amount of flour. Cover your dough and let it rest for half an hour while we talk about mistake number 12. Mistake number 12 is not using a bench scraper. Yes, you can make sourdough without a bench scraper. Of course you can do that. But it is infinitely easier to use one because it truly is like having a hand that the sourdough won't stick to. It's helpful in lots of different situations, but especially for flipping or cutting or just moving your dough. If you are new to sourdough, I would highly recommend using a bench scraper. Mistake number 13 is thinking that there is only one right way to shape your dough. Now that our dough has rested for 30 minutes, we're going to do the final shaping. There are lots of different ways to shape your bread. You just need to not panic over the different options. What is important is that it gets sealed up tightly in the end. I am going to do the head, shoulders, knees, and toes method, which is where we take the top of the sourdough and fold it downward. Bring in the two sides over itself, and then repeat on the bottom by bringing the bottom upward and the two sides in over itself. Then roll up the dough nice and tight so you create surface tension. When you've made this surface tension, we can go ahead and place our dough in the floured banneton, sprinkling a little bit of more flour on top of the dough. Place your covered dough in the fridge to cold proof overnight. Moving on to mistake number 14, which is not flouring your banneton. Now that you have shaped your dough, we are going to place it in the banneton. This dough is wet, so if you do not generously flour your banneton, the dough could end up sticking to the sides. If the dough sticks to the banneton, it will rip as you pour it out, which will hurt your dough and the rise that it gets. If you get through all the other steps to make sourdough and then it sticks to the banneton, you might just die a little bit inside. So don't risk it. Flour the banneton generously and then place your dough in the banneton and then cover the dough and place it in the fridge to cold proof overnight. Mistake number 15 is not using the poke test. Now that our dough has proofed overnight in the fridge, it's time to see if it's ready to go in the oven. A great way of doing that is performing the poke test. The poke test is when you place a finger in the dough and pull it back out. If the dough springs back right away, it needs more time to proof. If it doesn't spring back at all, it's actually overproofed. If it springs back about halfway, it is ready to be put in the oven. So instead of relying on a specific amount of time for the proofing, rely on your senses and the signs from your dough. Now that we know the dough is ready, we can go ahead and preheat the oven to 450 or 500 degrees with a cast iron combo or a Dutch oven inside for about 45 minutes to an hour. Place your dough on parchment paper and score the dough. When the timer is done, remove the preheated Dutch oven and place the dough inside. Cover it back up and place inside the oven for 20 minutes. After 20 minutes, we can remove the lid and see how nice the loaf looks. The crust is still super light, so now we put the dough back in the oven, lidless, for 10 minutes at 400 degrees. Mistake number 16 is burning the crust on the bottom of your bread over and over again. A simple way to prevent this is by putting a baking sheet under the Dutch oven. If you know your oven burns the bottom of your bread, place a baking sheet under your Dutch oven next time, and it will help protect the bottom of your bread. After 10 minutes, we can see that the bread is beautifully caramelized and looking incredible. As someone who really pushes for baking with the senses, I would say that mistake number 17 is baking for time instead of color. If you open the oven after the 10 minutes and the bread does not look crispy and caramelized, don't take it out. Leave it in until the golden crust has developed. And our last mistake is cutting into the bread too early. I know that it is just irresistible sometimes. But cutting into the bread too early will negatively affect the texture and not allow the bread to really set. So let your bread sit for at least an hour before slicing into it. It's difficult to find the words to explain how much better sourdough bread is than store-bought bread. They're not even on the same playing fields. This bread is natural, it's sustaining, it's good for you, and most of all, it's a product of your own work. There is nothing more satisfying than the successful bite of sourdough from your own labor. It's a process, so do not get discouraged. We all have made some pancakes. You just have to keep trying and working on it. Leave any questions that you have below. Make sure to download the free sourdough guides in the description, and I will see you next time.